All right, and also a note that closed captions are available if you would like those. All right, welcome everyone to the November data facing call for CARC. My name is Deb McCaffrey, and I am one of the coordinators of the data facing track. And on your screen right now is a little more about our organization, CARC, the Campus Research Computing Consortium. It's got a few different ways to get involved. The data facing track is part of what we call the People Network, which is community listservs and monthly calls around topics relevant to everyone. And then we also have interest and working groups that work towards specific deliverables for the field, and operations group that just help everything run. And if you are interested in getting more involved, you can check out the call doc. We have in the announcements thing links for you to get more involved if you would like. Cool. So today is an interview format, and we'll be interviewing Matthew Toro from Arizona State University. He is a broadly trained geographer serving as the director of maps, imagery, and geospatial services at ASU Library. He founds and leads the Map and Geospatial Hub. It is a traditional map library fused with a modern GIS center. Map and Geospatial Hub executes a wide variety of projects at the intersection of geography, history, cartography, and visualization. All right. And this is the first part of kind of a two-part themed series with the researcher facing track for GIS Day and I forget what week it was called. There's a week too. All right, so let's get into it. Let's see if I can get fancy and pin people. Wait, I need to spotlight. And cool. Did that work like I intended? Is it just me and Matthew?
It is. Good work.
Okay. Yes. Okay. All right, so to start things off, for folks who have never worked with GIS data before, could you give a brief overview of it? Right, so there's probably a lot of folks that know that you can't just open it up in Excel and work with it. So what makes it different exactly?
Sure. Good morning or good afternoon or evening, maybe for some of you. Hi, everybody. Yes, so geospatial data. You know, I've been doing GIS in the geospatial sector, if you will, for almost 2 decades. And you know, but I'm all about demystifying things. So I'm going to speak in a very straightforward layperson way. And I would say geospatial data actually aren't that special, dare I say. I know a lot of people might sort of be taken aback by that, but the real characteristic that separates geospatial data from aspatial or non-spatial data is that it has an explicit connection to either Earth geographical space, or some other celestial body, say the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars. And again, I want to sort of strike a chord that isn't too simplistic here, but at the end of the day, the most important factor is that it has an explicit connection to space in the form of coordinates. And the most common coordinate reference system that we use here on Earth, of course, is latitude and longitude, an angular-based system, right? The equator is 0 degrees, and the poles are 90 degrees north or 90 degrees south. And so by literally being able to coordinate where those data reside on a spatial surface, we can locate them. Otherwise, dare I say, I don't mean to blaspheme here, but dare I say, geospatial data aren't that intrinsically different. There are explicit components within the header of the data, if it may be a raster image that explicitly tells that image where it belongs on the surface of the earth, or with geometric objects, which are really just shapes, as I say, forgive the jargon, geometric objects. I'm really just talking about different discrete objects. We've all heard, I'm sure, points, lines, and polygons, but those are packaged, those geometric objects are packaged in a way that the file format itself contains information telling it where those objects, those points, lines, or polygons reside on the surface of the earth. And that's what's special about geospatial data, that they are location explicit. I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. So what are some reliable GIS-based data/metadata collection options that could be alternatives to like standard paper notebooks in the field, especially when in low to no network access areas?
Awesome. I'm definitely going to address that question, but before I do, I want to add more context to my response to the first one, because you appended to the end of your question, Deb, the notion that you can't just throw it into an Excel spreadsheet. The reality is actually you can. Those, for geometric vector data, they're called points, lines, and polygons. You can indeed extract a form of them that allows you to view them in simple tabular format. Sorry, I have my right-hand man here giving me a mouse. Thank you, Eric, very much. In any case, so you can view a vector polygon, you can view vector lines, you can view vector points in a raw comma-separated value, a raw CSV, or an Excel spreadsheet. I just want to say that because I want to make sure I address all aspects of that. Now, is it useful to import into a raw table format? Probably not so much, because geospatial data are most valuable when you can visualize them, right? So seeing them in a table is not the same as seeing them displayed as they're meant to across a map. Anyway, so the second question you asked was, what are some data collection methods apart from traditional paper notebooks used for collecting data and or metadata for spatial information? Did I summarize that right, Deb?
Yep. Yeah. And I forgot. I should paste them in after I ask them.
No, it's right here on the chat. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. I didn't notice it the first time. Thank you. So, admittedly, I've actually done a lot of field-based work with GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, of which there are many GNSS. Here in the United States, we call ours the Global Positioning System, GPS, but there's different ones. There's Galileo, there's GLONASS, different countries. It's really a geopolitical sort of phenomenon of different global navigation satellite systems that allow you to triangulate or trilaterate location through this constellation of satellites. And of course, it's geopolitical because no country wants to rely on another country's GNSS, aka GPS system. So they develop their own by investing millions, in some cases billions of dollars to put their own satellites in orbit around the Earth. In any case, so how do you get data? How do you collect data in the field that contains location? Typically, you have some form of a GPS receiver device. This is not technically a GPS receiver. This is a smartphone, which, as we all know, has a built-in GPS that allows us to collect location-based data in the form of coordinates at various degrees of accuracy. But so the smartphone has become ubiquitous in all of our lives, right? We use it for so much. It's sort of hard to imagine life without it these days. But I would say there are multiple smartphone applications that serve as data collection instruments, and they could be very crude in the form of just taking a photograph. Technically, if you have your location-based services not turned off, if you keep them on, all of your photographs and all of the videos can indeed store location tags. And that's a form of geospatial metadata that allows that photo to know explicitly on the surface of the Earth through coordination, through coordinates, where those photographs or video content belong. So in that case, our smartphone devices are a data collection instrument. But if you're actually conducting science or ethnography, in my case, I spent a lot of time in in the country of Lao PDR, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, aka Laos, conducting field work, and I've done similar work in Latin America. And I was going to different households, collecting the household level information, and I wanted a GPS coordinate associated with the more robust, semi-structured, and in some cases fully structured interviews, where I have sort of a structured set of responses that I could put in, just like any survey or response mechanism. You could structure it as you wish. So I didn't have that. I didn't have the plethora of applications that are available now for my smartphone app, but there are indeed so many applications. A common one that is increasingly gaining or growing in popularity is something called Esri Survey. It's by Esri, ESRI, Environmental Systems Research Institute. It's called Survey 123, and it allows you sort of to prepare a robust survey instrument, and then download on this application, Survey 123. And obviously the survey is available on your smartphone application. You have already spent time investing in front of a proper PC, or even on your phone, whatever, proper PC or Mac, structuring your survey, structuring the data, the valid data responses, structuring how the user interaction, how do you actually input those various data inputs. And that's one method, but there are many apps that have similar functionality. There are, of course, tried and true traditional GPS receiver devices. They look like this, or there's more robust ones that are used in more civil and environmental engineering fields, basically for geomatics and geodetics, for land surveying, that have more robust little handheld data input things. And that's usually for sub-meter. These days you can get down to sub-centimeter accuracy. And those are structured for more engineering applications. But if you're doing research and collecting data on bird migrations or ecological research on the habitats of various species or whatever, typically you as the scientist, as a subject matter expert, will go ahead and define your data domain. What are the valid values, as I already mentioned, and you can structure your interface, your GUI, your graphical user interface, on your proper GPS device, which is again a little handheld thing, or it could be a larger thing, and you structure those data inputs so that when you're in the field and you're mostly concerned about collecting that critical coordinate information, where, right? That's what's special about geospatial or GIS. Where's it located? But then you need all those supplemental attributes that give context and meaning to that simple data point. So, having a coordinate is great. We know where it is, but what does it mean? What's the qualitative or quantitative values that you want associated with it to give that data point or data line or data object, bounded polygon, whatever it may be, meaning, so that you can pump it back into your proper GIS, Geographic Information System software, and actually be able to work with those data and produce meaningful analyses in the form of spatial analysis, and ultimately I would hope you would want to disseminate that work through some form of geovisualization. And I go there to the end of the data pipeline, to the sort of data visualizations point, because it's not always a pure data pipeline from sort of point A to point B. We think, okay, we go out, we collect the data. That's the beginning of the data pipeline. Then we have to clean the data, sort of massage it, make it formatted properly, and then we make maps or whatever. But the truth is, in the sort of rubber meets the road real world of data analysis, spatial analysis, data, working with data, as I'm sure many folks listening know, it's actually a very iterative process, right? So especially in the geospatial domain, that's why geospatial data visualization or geovisualization is so powerful. We might want to first do what is the equivalent of sort of looking at descriptive statistics. In some ways, looking at your data visualized is a way to start looking for hypotheses, to start understanding your better, know thy data, right? So you sort of throw it on a map, look at the spatial pattern. We as humans can identify crude spatial patterns, but our software with advanced geoprocessing algorithms, et cetera, can identify patterns that are sort of simple primate brains and naked eyes often can't identify. But in the process of developing more robust and meaningful hypotheses to test statistically in your software, you want to sort of first visualize it and then go back to the drawing board. And it's a very sort of repetitious, iterative cycle So anyway, this is a very long-winded response, and I went in multiple directions, but there are multiple applications that can be installed on a smartphone or on a specialized software system where you can format the GUI, the graphical user interface, and you can input those data however you need. That's kind of vague and kind of specific all at once, but maybe at the end we'll have a more open question and answer session if anyone needs clarity.
Okay, yeah, so it sounds like there's apps for the actual geospatial component, and it's almost like you're geotagging your scientific data, basically.
That's exactly right. And that's why I sort of, forgive the language here, but I sort of de-fetishize the spatial side of things. And I know spatial is special. I know there's a lot of technical components, but the truth is, working with these types of data for so long, it's actually not that special. It's really just co-registering and co-locating everything. And that's where the power comes in, because everything is spatially coordinated, that you can then ask questions of your data in layers. And so data collection is so quintessential, but the real analytical power comes from the algorithms and geoprocessing tools that are afforded by proper GIS software platforms.
Okay, next question. How do you use GIS to document decision points that are relevant to data quality assurance and uncertainty? For example, in the field, departures from standard operating procedures due to external forces, site-specific challenges, etc.
Yeah. That's a great question, because it's so authentic. It's real. It reflects how messy the real process of science and data collection is. So yeah, a long time ago in a life far away, I was a much younger man, and I used to work for a local municipality in the greater Miami metropolitan region. It's an affluent suburb called Coral Gables. Anyone from South Florida certainly knows of Coral Gables. Anyway, I worked for the Public Works Department. Again, this is the department that handles sort of civil engineering projects, stormwater drains, public utilities in general. And I had at the time, it was a very advanced DGPS, differential global positioning system. I looked like a Ghostbuster. So I wore a backpack with a big antenna sticking out, and I felt so cool. I was like 18 years old. I walking around, getting paid to walk around the city. It felt like the coolest job. But I reference all that because one very common. So my job was to collect sub-meter geotag, basically the locations of all these utilities. And utilities come, like I mentioned, stormwater infrastructure, light poles, and other sort of public or other amenities or utilities that are physically located within the built environment, but specifically within the public right-of-way, right? That is public assets or assets that are managed by the local city government, the local municipality. Often, this question is so great because it reflects, like I said, the real-world reality. Often, there might be an asset that I need to record with my Ghostbuster DGPS, but that asset is physically obstructed, or my access to stand right there and to collect that point as accurately as possible is obstructed by some sort of whatever, street furniture, whatever it may be. So I need to, one very practical way is to input into the notes, again, because you're using some sort of GUI, you're using some sort of interface to input these things. So it's really the modern and digital version of sort of paper notes that you could write, but you make notes that are recorded in the data itself. So within the sort of output table that will inevitably be associated with those graphical points. So you have, ultimately, I'm collecting utility data, and I'm going to create a map that has a bunch of points, thousands, no exaggeration, thousands of points locating where all these things are. And it's not just graphic design we're doing, right? We're actually, it's geographic information systems. So we need to have all that information associated with it. So I'm not just collecting the location, which in and of itself is extremely valuable information, but I'm collecting a description of the stormwater, the diameter of the stormwater drain, the model of the utility pole, what have you. So when I enter all those, I would have the foresight, because I know what I'm doing, and I would structure my data entry mechanism such that I have a field that indicates something like a spatial offset. I finally responded to the question. So I would, after all that, I finally got to my answer. So if something is, so I would literally measure it on the ground and input my notes, and I would basically use the angles of a circle I don't want to get too technical here, but if we say north is 360 degrees slash 0 degrees, east is 90 degrees, south is 180, west is 270, I would measure the angle. So I wouldn't be able to stand where I needed to stand, but I would stand offset maybe 5 meters away at a particular azimuth or angle away from that asset, record my angle offset and record my distance offset by physically measuring the horizontal ground distance between where I actually recorded the point with my Ghostbuster contraption and where the point actually resides on the real surface of the earth. That's one way. That's a long-winded anecdote for one application, but the same concept holds true for virtually any application. Since location is really the crux, the differentiating quality that adds value to spatial data versus aspatial data, you need to get that location right. And it can be something as seemingly crude and simple, but still very effective as adding a spatial and angular offset to where those information are collected.
That was a great answer. It really helps to have like concrete examples like that.
Thank you for that. But yeah, I'm looking at this question is really well written. Because it reflects, I love it because it reflects real world conditions. Like for instance, weather. I would imagine for weather, you can't get somewhere or because of inclement weather, and that would alter the sort of temporality of your data. Like you're trying to collect data when you have a certain sun angle, when you have clear weather conditions, and you have to withhold your data collection until the weather passes, or you get it in weather that is inclement, and that's probably affecting the accuracy of your GPS, right? Because you're not getting the same spatial accuracy. Instead of a margin of error of 1 to 3 feet, you're getting a margin of error of 2 to 7 feet. And that should also be recorded within your data collection mechanism.
Next question, moving on to more privacy-based things. All right, so some geospatial data are sensitive by nature, water quality data, private wells. What are some other examples of sensitive geospatial data?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to follow up with that, Deb? I'm sorry.
No, that was it. Go ahead.
Really brilliant. I was just commending another excellent and very real world question. So in my world, I'm both I've been on multiple stages of the data collection pipeline, and now my career has brought me, for the most part, towards the end of that pipeline, where I'm technically dealing with more mature, already pre-processed data. And if there's any takeaway here, I hope there's several takeaways, but I don't need to tell you all this. I hope I'm not being overly simplistic to the point where it sounds almost condescending, but data always are subject to some sort of processing pipeline, right? It's rare that, there are analysts who, in the form of satellite imagery, for instance, work with a form of the satellite imagery, the raw digital numbers collected from optical satellite imagery sensors, and the form of those data that an end user sees has been transformed. Not manipulated sort of nefariously in any way, but transformed to make it relevant and useful for the analyst. So just want to say I really love this question, because often we want to collect data that has real use constraints for very good reasons. And it's taken me a long time to sort of come to terms with this because, philosophically, I want all data to be free and open, fully transparent world, but there's very justifiable reasons. So apart from private wells, which is a great example, that can impact home values. Anything with a national security or geopolitical security dimension. For instance, critical infrastructure that's essential. If anyone's driven across the Hoover Dam, for instance, one of the great civil engineering feats of the 20th century, that there's security there, right? So when you pass through the dam sometimes, or at least when I was there pre-pandemic, they actually do a very casual and generally brief checkpoint while you're driving across the Hoover Dam, because that big piece of infrastructure is worth hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, whatever, and it needs to sort of be safe. So any sort of infrastructure data, of course, we can get a point locating the Hoover Dam, but I would challenge some of you to find a point for all of the nuclear reactors in the country. It can be found. They're definitely doable, but it takes a little more data sleuthing. Critical water, again, anything sort of infrastructure, water processing plants. Those are, again, they're out there. You can find their addresses and find them and sort of map them easily, but you'd be hard pressed to find a very nice, clean, easily packaged, ready to go data set of critical infrastructure in the United States. let me move away from that to another more practical one. Archaeological sites or other sites of cultural sensitivity. Those are very important. I live here in Arizona, but I'm an East Coast guy from Miami, Florida. I'm a city guy who's been living sort of, again, I'm in a city in Phoenix, Arizona, but most of my time is spent exploring the wonderland of greater Arizona. And there's lots of rich archaeological sites out here. I would love, just as sort of a well-intentioned guy, to go check out the archaeological ruins, but understandably, these are culturally sensitive sites, often Native American or indigenous communities. They're often sacred for those reasons. Often the agency, either a federal or state or other agency that has jurisdiction over these sites, wants to restrict knowledge of the rich archaeological findings. I mean, you can all imagine people trying to sell artifacts, people going to vandalize archaeological sites. So national security, archaeology, and sort of cultural preservation. Of course, the big elephant in the room, and probably the most preponderant one, is public or data for epidemiology and public health studies. These data have, personal identifiable information, and probably the biggest discussions and discourse around geospatial data confidentiality and data ethics. The most sort of potent conversations typically happen around public health, because we're dealing with inherently big data, large studies, large NIH, National Institutes of Health, or National Science Foundation, NSF, NIH or NSF, big grant funded projects that look at massive sample sizes. I mean, I was with a team at the University of Miami, and we looked at Medicare, Medicaid recipients, and we were looking at a lot of factors, but basically looking at the built environment and the way, basically looking at the preponderance of obesity and walkability. I know that sounds really out there, but it's epidemiology, public health, a very integrative social science that takes from multiple fields. And we're looking at the way newly arrived immigrants who are on Medicare or Medicaid, I know, very complex, would actually traverse the built environment. Like, how do they get around? Are they automobile dependent, as so many of us are here in the United States, which is inherently a more sedentary lifestyle? Inherently, we're sitting more, we're being less physically active with labor-saving devices. Sorry, I'm going on a rant here, but so how do you anonymize these data? How do you ensure the confidentiality of these data? And there's a rich literature describing different methods, but we, of course, anonymize those data so we can strip those data points of all of their identifiable demographic information, the names, etc. But we still have something that is quasi-identifiable, or not even quasi, like explicitly identifiable, location, right? So, there's a lot of ways to simulate data, use data simulators to reflect the sort of statistical characteristics of your actual input data, and then simulate a data set. But that right there introduces a form of data uncertainty and inaccuracy. And there's already a plethora of issues around geospatial data uncertainty, right? The world is constantly changing. Any map you see is inherently wrong in multiple ways, because the world has already changed by the time that map went to print. There's already, taking three-dimensional spherical data, turning it into a two-dimensional map, that's a form of data uncertainty and data warping, because we've ultimately transformed the actual geometric or location of those data and where those data are, what they're representing. There's so many other issues of data uncertainty. So my point is, it's a messy world. There are lots of ways to address it. Of course, with any sort of big study that involves identifiable information, you have to get IRB approval, right? Institutional Review Board. And you have to ensure that you minimize or that you protect the privacy of these data, and that you minimize any potential risk to your study population. Needless to say, whenever you have humans involved in the study and you're modeling human behavior or human phenomena versus the phenomena or behavior of inanimate objects or animate non-human objects, it gets much trickier and sort of more regulated. But there are methods to anonymize them. There are methods of spatial offset. Actually, the same concept I invoked when I talked about my anecdote of working for the city of Coral Gables a long time ago. You can artificially introduce offsets to anonymize your data. We're all familiar with Google Earth or Google Maps. You can put in an address, it'll take you right to the address. But typically, I don't know exactly how the Google algorithm works. If you input a specific address, it usually takes you right to that address. But I've seen behavior on Google Maps that I can't describe sort of accurately or credibly right now, but anecdotally, if you'll permit it, you can go into Google maps and input an address. And typically it won't take you exactly to that exact address. Sometimes it will take you in between two houses, sort of on the cusp, on the border of them. Needless to say, it's easy to deduce where that house actually is, but there's ways to offset the data. Ultimately, it's a big, messy situation, and you should probably have a real data expert on site to guide you and sort of consult on the best above board data anonymization method or de-identification method. Because again, for epidemiological studies, spatial epidemiology studies, you need that spatial component. You can't throw it out. It's essential to the study. It's what's going to separate your study. I'm sure we've all heard of the John Snow, mid-19th century cholera map, right? That sort of revolutionized spatial epidemiology, looking at the transmission of cholera through the water pumps around London, et cetera. You can't do micro scale geospatial analyses without having that accuracy. So it's a messy world, but it can be done. Obviously, there's lots of precedents for it. I know that response was all over the place, but yeah, we can talk more about it later. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. It actually kind of addressed the next two questions, so we can just skip those.
Nice, because I'll just rant on and confuse
Yeah.
you.
But yeah, I know de-identification is real tricky. Like there's a similar issue with dates. Like dates are inherently identifiable.
I saw that. Yeah. And sorry to just, dates. I mean, that's another thing, so let's say we strip a person's identity, they have no name. Great. But we have the date of their visit. Theoretically, I guess if someone is really a sinister person, they can sort of reconstruct or reverse engineer who was there on that particular date, because there's a whole associated medical record associated with it. Yes. So, I mean, time, date is a form of time, right? Time is a form of identification. Location is a form of identification. We're typically used to just our identity, right? A social security number or a name identifying us, but there's other ways to sort of identify who it was, and it can get messy and tricky. And the truth is, every time we as data analysts or data stewards or data managers employ some method to conceal or de-identify in some creative way, and we think we've found the solution, the hard reality is we've almost certainly introduced some form of bias or skewed our data in one way or another. So it's the balance between scientific replicability, and that's another thing. How do you reproduce and replicate it unless you are explicitly sharing your de-identification methods with the world? And in which case, if you're sort of revealing the magic to make them invisible or make them de-identified, then it gets very tricky. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But yes, there's so many ways to identify, but anytime you employ one of those methods, you are complicating the science. That's the reality.
Yeah. Speaking of both time and location, I imagine you can combine them to get more of a travel path. Like you can map someone's Google Maps directions or something. Which I've talked with transportation researchers before, and just like even a little bit of a car trip is enough to identify a person. So is that treated differently in terms of privacy? Is it just like you have to be even more careful?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably the one I'm least qualified to ask or answer, excuse me. I would say I think we all collectively, when we all use a navigation app like Google Maps or Waze or some other navigation software, and forgive me if I'm deviating from the nature of the question, but I'll just talk about this briefly and maybe readdress the question if I'm getting too far off track, no pun intended, because we're ultimately talking about people tracking your location, right? But I think we all make the sacrifice, sort of social contract. We all go into this sort of abstract social contract wherein we're willing to sacrifice the anonymity of our particular path or trajectory through space, in exchange for the benefits of having the navigation software to know the path of least resistance or the fastest navigational route from point A to point B or wherever you're going. So I don't know how on the back end on Google servers or Waze servers that is handled, but clearly I'm speaking of a completely different application entirely. We're talking about navigation. and that's why I think I'm deviating from the question. I imagine, Deb, that the nature of this question is talking about in global in movement studies and track like actual scientific studies. Yeah, so I admittedly haven't done a lot of empirical research. That some of my research actually has done this, but we haven't actually developed trajectories and linear paths. And the reality is, I'm sorry if I'm speaking too informally, too casually here, but the reality is, yes, as your transportation analyst colleagues have stated to you in the past, Deb, it is possible to reconstruct, to reverse engineer, and to reverse engineer a particular, I'll call it migratory path, whatever, or movement path in a study, and identify who it is by co-registering those data points that collectively are used to create basically a linear line, right? To create a literal line in your data. Of course, those lines are created by vertexes or vertices, and each one of those vertices are stamped with other identifiable characteristics. But again, this is all in the abstract. But if the analyst has taken the proper measures to de-identify every one of those particular vertices, each one of those individual points that collectively construct the dimensions or angles of the line, then you have at least created layers of separation and layers of anonymity. However, the reality is, with enough resources, it could all be reverse engineered. The question is it practical? The hacker or whatever sort of malintended person would really have to bend over backwards to try to reconstruct this. And I think in a practical world where real research needs to get done on real human actors, I think the Institutes of Review Board and all these sort of committees that ensure the protection of the human subjects for human subjects research, I think it's defensible if in the grant application or the scientific methodological work plan, if you articulate how you are really striving to do it. Of course, there's always a risk. I mean, by participating in the modern economy, we all have banks, right? Digital banks. We all have account and routing numbers. By doing that, we're all sort of implicitly saying we agree to the protective measures that banks and other financial institutions are making to protect our data. But the truth is, if someone wanted it bad enough, they can get it with enough resources. That's the hard reality. And that's why we just need to be vigilant as data managers, data stewards, data analysts, to employ as many methods as possible while preserving the integrity of the science and the underlying analytical activity in exchange for while ensuring the protection of our subjects. Again, long-winded and abstract, but that's the best I got.
All right, now we will move on to audience questions. I did receive one already, so we'll start with that. And it's kind of not specific to geospatial data, but more sensitive data in particular, right? So when you de-identify data, it does basically create two data sets to curate. There's confidential original data and then the shareable data set. Do you have any thoughts or tips on how to preserve and curate the two?
Excellent point. A good friend of mine who recently finished her PhD in epidemiology, she was looking at data that came from a centralized data source managed by the state of Arizona, Arizona health data. And I'm speaking on behalf of someone else's research, so I don't know all the details. But and I've worked on similar public health and epidemiology studies. I don't do so much of that research these days anymore, but where there is a centralized sort of authoritative, typically a governmental agency that has the raw, most vulnerable data. And then, yes, there is basically a clone, but a slightly modified clone of that data that's de-identified, et cetera. My understanding is us, or at least I would think the members of this audience, mostly have to worry about the latter, the de-identified version. And the former, the highly vulnerable, highly sensitive data, is managed on extremely secure, highly encrypted data servers. And it is a regulatory, you have to jump through multiple regulatory hoops, IRB approval being one of many, to even be able to liaise and engage with that authoritative data steward entity, typically, like I said, a government entity, to even access those data. And access is typically granted to a very small number of users. So that's one measure. And ultimately, there's probably a data czar, no pun intended, no joke intended. There's actually probably a sort of a head honcho type of person who typically may not even have access to the data his or herself, but simply acts as a gatekeeper to that data. And generally, philosophically, I'm highly opposed to gatekeeping. But in the case of what we're talking about today, obviously, we need gatekeepers for legal and for the protection of human subjects and other type of sensitive data. But I don't want to dismiss this question because it's very, very relevant. But I would say maybe it's worded slightly incorrectly, because I don't think there's actually any curation that needs to happen. You're really only dealing with one that would have any sort of currency amongst the team of researchers. There's only one that would be floating around, a very small and privileged group of researchers who are privy to see the data. I mean, I've worked on studies where I was one of the few people who could actually see the data, and my supervisor at the time, he would just advise me on what hypotheses to test and what to do with it. He himself didn't have the authority to look at the data, because by study design and by the operational staff and team model, we designed it such that only so many eyes or humans can actually look at those data. So I would say, yes, the premise is absolutely right. It's a clone, it's a copy, thereby effectively multiplying it. But in practice, are we, as the data managers, data stewards, data analysts, are we actually dealing with the raw stuff? Typically not. We should not have to curate both. The former, the highly sensitive stuff, should be locked away, and sort of never looked at again, except by those extremely few eyes that have extremely high level clearance, etc.
Yeah. And I can speak a bit on this in a clinical setting, when you have like a research copy of an electronic health record. It's generally some type of database that you have to script a query. So generally what they do is preserve the queries as well as the de-identified and curated data set to help with that. But I really, like, the word raw is the right word for the original data. It's just the raw data set, kind of like the raw files that come off a research instrument. So it's generally you don't do much to those, and all you want them to do is just exist there for reproducibility's sake. Cool. Any more questions?
I think Sid had not a question, but a comment, a relevant comment that I can actually speak to as well. Having wearables, some of that research, I hope I pronounced your name, Sid, but some of that research I invoked earlier, looking at walkability, we actually had different metrics, different measures of what there's a self-reported physical activity, which was inherently subjective, because the human participant in that study was reflecting through her or his own biases how active they were. So, they would fill out basically a survey mechanism. And then there's an objectively measured physical activity in the form of a wearable device, such as an accelerometer, for instance, that physically measures various things, but fundamentally it's an instrument to measure how active you're moving, but it can typically measure other elements as well. I mean, we all wear, not me personally, but I know they're very popular. I wouldn't be surprised if one or more of you have a so-called Fitbit, like a little Fitbit watch or an Apple Watch. I know that has applications that can measure heart rate and BMI and all these other things. That's another form of a wearable device. And all those data, unless you have actively turned off your geotagging, your geolocation component of them, all those data should have that spatial component, which is, I would argue, probably, over the last several decades, it's become increasingly novel, or it's been sort of novel to have a spatial component. But I think we're at the point in sort of the broad arc of science and history wherein having spatial data associated with all these other meaningful data points is becoming a commonplace. And so these questions and sort of issues of anonymity and privacy and protection of subjects are becoming more relevant. So I just want to give kudos to that person who mentioned the wearables thing, because it strikes at the heart of all this, and I think it's very apropos.
Ooh, here's an interesting question. Are there precautions researchers should take when doing extreme geocoding online, like Bellingcat, which is a journalist outlet? where the intent is to publicly reveal bad actors.
Wow, juicy question. I like where your head's at, Christina. Okay. First of all, I want to sort of call myself. I'm embarrassed. I wasn't familiar with Bellingcat, but very cool. It sounds like a sort of noble thing if the point is to reveal bad actors. But like any sort of well-intended tool or weapon, it can be used in bad ways, right? So I'm not familiar with the Bellingcat project or initiative or thing. Forgive my ignorance. But are the precautions researchers should take? Well, I would say if the point is to reveal unethical or immoral behavior. Oh, thank you for additional context. Bellingcat proved Russia fired that missile. That, yeah, I don't watch enough news. Sorry. Thank you for that. Wow. Okay. Juicy stuff. I'm feeling so embarrassed that I didn't know about that. Thank you, Christina. So Bellingcat proved Russia fired the missile that took down an airline over Ukraine several years ago. Thank you for that clarification. So the question is, are the precautions researchers should take when doing extreme geocoding online? Christina, if you're at liberty, could you, while I'm sort of piecing together in my mind a response, could you give a little context? Actually, even verbally, so you don't have to type it out if you're comfortable with that. But I would like to hear more about the extreme geocoding side. Oh, nice. Yeah. If you're at liberty, Christina, speak up so you don't have to type it. But because I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by extreme geocoding and make sure that my response reflects that. But I would just say, if it's researchers doing work to reveal bad actors, clearly that researcher is putting her or himself in, making her or himself a target for these bad actors. And if we're talking about geopolitical things like war crimes and shooting missiles, that's dangerous territory. So I would say the risk isn't so much in doing the extreme geocoding. The risk is leaving a digital paper trail, as it were, of who performed that extreme geocoding, who's the actor, who's the person who is sort of sleuthing all these data to expose the illegal or illicit actions of actors. And I would just say protect yourself. And that's basically hacker level stuff that I'm not qualified to speak about, but obviously using a VPN and encrypted VPN and sort of, I don't even know, but I would just say, yes, protect yourself if you're doing that. I wouldn't care so much about revealing the identity of the bad actor because they're the ones committing the crimes or whatever.
Well, I would just add that some of the thoughts, I wear multiple hats when it comes to these things. So for our research, we would mostly focus on what I do professionally, acquiring data sets in the open and making sure an upload integrity when the Fed does GIS-based research. But in the military, sometimes trying to document, you brought up things that mattered, those wearables, the architecture sites, the fact that things that you would think wouldn't be targets, such as grain elevators, that information came down very quickly in Ukraine, when that happened. But also documenting war crimes, geocoding, the proving the fact was, we didn't blow up a hospital. Yes, you did. And here's the proof that it was a hospital at the time you blew it up. So there's actually a lot of organizations like Bellingcat who are doing a ton of research all over the world, trying to document war crimes in the hopes that when these people are held accountable. So I was just curious, some of that is, of course, storing data that's important. But a lot of that is crowdsourced and relies on volunteers to come in and do it. So then you have reliability of the data. Someone's got to go in and verify it. Right? So I don't know. It's really, there's a lot of layers to it.
Those are all excellent points and excellent contributions. Thank you. And thank you for teaching me a lot of that. I'm legitimately curious, and I'm going to go down a lot of rabbit holes later this afternoon learning about all this. But I do want to just mention and build upon the point you just made, Christina, about crowdsourced data. Believe it or not, in the esoteric world of, actually not so esoteric anymore, but in the specialized world of geospatial data and GI science, geographic information science, there is a formal term for crowdsourced information. It's called VGI, volunteered geographic information, and it is essentially that's a bit of jargon to basically say crowdsourced data. The biggest source of crowdsourced information, of course, is the so-called Wikipedia of maps, which is called OpenStreetMap, right? Which is actually a big database, of geometric objects that map our world, and users contribute to it, just like we can all contribute to Wikipedia, the global encyclopedia, right? We can all contribute to OSM, OpenStreetMap, and these data are very powerful. And as a matter of fact, when you go into Google Maps or any other big mapping platform like Esri or Google Maps or Microsoft Maps or Apple Maps, whatever, they purchase, these big mapping platforms purchase data from big data vendors, but they also, you will see, if you look at the credits for that map, you will almost invariably see, and the OpenStreetMap user community, meaning that they use a lot of proprietary vendor sources to produce their base maps, but they also use perhaps the best and most robust source of mapping data available, which is all VGI, volunteer geographic information, aka crowdsourced information from OpenStreetMap, because that's where you have the most micro, meaning in terms of cartographic scale, the most large scale, the most magnified, zoomed in data available. I have a colleague here at ASU. I'm going to be very brief because I know we're hitting time soon. A colleague here at ASU, he wants to collaborate with me on a project, for a student-led project where they're mapping community. This was pre the current Israel-Palestine war, but he approached me several months ago saying, oh, we want to map different parts of Palestinian communities. A quasi-state, not an officially recognized state actor, but there are lots of OSM, community-driven data, and that's such a powerful form of data. But yes, as Christina rightly points out, just like in Wikipedia, there is vandalism. I can go in and vandalize and deliberately write misinformation about something or someone or whatever as a form of internet vandalism. And in the same vein, I could do that for OpenStreetMap. The beauty of the internet, of course, is that it's, for the most part, democratic, and there's always someone who wants to be smarter than you. So if you write wrong information, hopefully the sort of collective commons will come and rectify it quickly, but it is a form of vandalism that might reside there for several days or hours or days before it gets corrected. Ditto with OpenStreetMap, right? You could, and that's the power of geographic information. I mean, entire wars have been fought over the lines of territory, right? I mean, that's a whole like master's thesis on that, right? But yeah, crowdsourced data is awesome. It's valuable. There is a reliability dimension, but like everything in this world, especially in this sort of post-truth, highly relativistic, postmodern world, the veracity of your information should always be questioned, right? We should always sort of strive for highly reliable, credible data. And that comes from, as most of you are from the library world, that comes from, tapping into credible sources, et cetera, and ensuring the integrity of your data with properly documented metadata, et cetera.
Okay, and let's see if we can squeeze this last question in. What are some of the most common requests and support questions / trends you're seeing from the research community at ASU?
Wow, such a great question. Thank you for that, Justin. And we are indeed ending at noon, right, Deb?
Yep.
Like 3. Yeah. Okay. So I'll be brief. So my unit here, and I'm sort of relieved to say this because I know many of you are from the library community and similar sort of big data research support communities that have tangential or related roles as that of librarians. My shop here, if I can talk about it briefly, it's we are, as most library shops are, inherently transdisciplinary by design, right? So we get requests from people coming from public health, all the way to people in architecture and landscape architecture, to people in art, like true art, who want to create 3D prints or use actual, use terrain data to create robust art pieces in multiple forms, from sculpture to whatever. So without exaggeration, because I know this is an inherently watered down answer, but without exaggeration, we are a generalist shop by design. We must be, in order to be able to translate the needs of the users, the needs of the undergraduate or graduate students or faculty or postdocs, whatever, to translate those needs into real solutions. And we need to be able to have a vocabulary that is sort of generalized enough to where we're not invoking the jargon of one specialized discipline, right? And because that can be disenfranchising to our patrons, right? To our user base. And we want to ensure that we provide the best quality service. So that's a lot of context to basically say we get requests from everyone. Most recently, we got a request from folks from a prominent sort of center here at ASU that does a lot of coral reef mapping. And that wasn't necessarily a data request per se. They were talking to us about requesting technical support to help build out web mapping applications. So that's on the far end of the data support cycle, where they have already processed their data and they want to create a public outreach tool to show people, local community members in Hawaii, where some of the coral reef mapping has been happening and how they can get involved, et cetera. So that was more on application development. In epidemiology, it's often methodologies for not necessarily de-identifying, because hopefully they've already jumped through those hoops, but it's spatial statistical methodologies for looking at things like autocorrelation, for looking at mapping techniques, coral plus maps, the maps that are, the most iconic sort of data-driven maps that are just different graduated colors of shapes. Those are inherently have a lot of issues. Ecological fallacy is the sort of overarching thing. Modifiable aerial unit problem. Basically, the unit at which you are collecting your aggregated geospatial data will inherently bias the results of your statistical analysis. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here, by the way. A lot of what I said is moot when you're dealing with maps of artificial island building by China in the South Pacific. Those maps and those end products are at such a coarse scale, I know we're at time, that sort of anonymity doesn't matter so much. But when you're dealing with small geographic units like census tracts or blocks or block groups or blocks, which is the smallest U.S. Census Bureau unit, that's when you deal with issues. So that was sort of a non-answer because it was all over the place, but we deal with requests from everybody, and I appreciate the question. Sorry for talking so much.
No worries. All right. Cool. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for coming, everyone. And
Thanks so
thank you
much for listening to me. Yeah.
Mhm.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much.